It's funny, man. It's funny. I have more anxiety about this one just because we've structured it.
I think it should be fun. It's a lot of stuff that we've talked about before. Um, all right, so the topic of today is what is awakening? And as Stephen has said, we've never structured anything before, and I feel like this is also barely a structure. The furthest we've gone with the structure up to this point, and what we've done, all we've done is we decided on this question at the end of the last podcast: what is awakening? And we stated it then. So Stephen and I kind of have been marinating on this topic for about a week, and today we are going to see uh, what's the result of that marination. And I guess we're just going to talk about it and see where we're at. I know I didn't do a lot of personal work around. I literally spent 10 minutes before this conversation looking up notes on the books I've read about awakening. So I haven't actually done any like as much pre-work as I thought I would. What about you, Stephen?
Yeah, thanks, Hack, for the expectation setting and the level set. I would say that it was the exact same for me, which is why I think that this experiment is really fun for the both of us. And I wouldn't say it was quite a marinade, more like a dry rub. You know, marinade is like marinade it penetrates. So, but I think just even loosely carrying the thought throughout the week is significant. I know that at least the way my mind works, and I get the sense that it's same for you, Hack. Like that we are very high on like pattern seeking. So I think even just holding that and then like having little moments throughout life kind of reinforce or add to that it was helpful. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, very excited. This is like $1 million topic or million Bitcoin topic, if you will. What is awakening?
We're gonna try to take a crack at it.
Yeah, yeah. Let's try to take a crack at it. I think it's good to let's try to probably define it in layman's terms uh, to start, and we'll see how esoteric it gets there. Um, I guess I say another structural element we've introduced for this one is to try to go back towards brevity, right? We're shooting for that 30, 40 minute mark again. So let's go off to the races. What is awakening? Hack, you up first.
All right. So the context around this, I don't think I even considered what awakening was until like maybe a couple years ago, and I think I've been on my own personal spiritual journey for at least almost coming up on 10 years now. And when I say spiritual journey, I mean like reading, spiritual books, meditation, psychedelics, things like that, where I'm like trying to observe my own mind and my own consciousness and kind of figure out what that is uh, through many resources from within, which is like meditation and psychedelics, but also like reading spirituality books, which is, other um, people that have gone this path before that obviously know a little bit more than I do about this topic. But even having read those books, for let's say this process started 10 years ago when I first read an Eckhart Tolle book. Um, it wasn't until the last like 1 or 2 years that even I even thought about awakening, because to me it was such an esoteric concept that wasn't something that was like concrete. Like you're trying to use words to describe this like spiritual experience, and so when you see the word awakening, you just kind of like gloss over it. I know like yeah. So just for context, I didn't even start thinking about what that was until like maybe 1 or 2 years ago. Anytime I saw the word, I just glossed over it. Um, but if I had to define it in as quickly as possible in one sentence or less with that context, I believe we live in a world of mental constructions, all of us. And the only way that we're able to function in the world collectively, such as in any group settings, any team settings, or societal settings, or within your nation, is that you have these mental constructions that everyone kind of like agrees upon. And when I say constructions, I mean like these invisible barriers that force us to act a certain way. The fact that I'm a brother within my family, I act like this. The fact that I'm a son, I act like this. The fact that, I don't know, I'm a Redskins fan, I act like this. And you know, I act the same amongst all these other Redskins fans, or amongst my family, or amongst, like, I don't know, um, people within my religion, or let's say I'm married to someone, I act a certain way because I'm a husband. Um, I think awakening is simply seeing all those mental constructions for what they are, which are the invisible forces that guide us in how we act. And the thing is, these forces, like these invisible forces, these mental constructions, they're very powerful because um, obviously they not only guide us in how to act, but our direct experience, like we hurt, like anytime somebody that was, I guess, like supposed to do something doesn't do something that we expect. Um, so yeah, I know that was in one sentence, but I think I'm good for now. Steven, you help me out.
Yeah, yeah. So what's funny about this, as we were talking, and we frequently bring up this characteristic of conversation being so dynamic, and that you're constantly queuing things up just based on what the other person is saying. And it's funny because, like, as I was going into this conversation, I didn't know if we were going to be trading definitions of awakening, but I think based on what you said, I more want to just ask questions because I think it's more fun that way. But and I certainly do have like kind of like a pre-canned version of awakening that I can share maybe as we move through. But something that you mentioned, you went out right at the gate with, that I wanted to ask a question about, which was that the uh, at default there's this construct that allows us to cooperate with one another, right? And to some degree, I think you're alluding that awakening is kind of a departure from that construct, just because that construct can cause, types of suffering that may or may not be actually required of you when you start to think about it, right? And who wouldn't want to, like, get away from suffering that they don't have to go through? So, but my kind of question to you would be, there are a bunch of animals that are highly cooperative, right? And work together. Do they, or can they experience awakening, or are they already awakened? I was wondering what your view on that is.
Okay, I do have an answer, but this is something that that's just gonna spit straight from my thoughts
Let's do it.
into my mouth out into the screen. So I don't know how correct this is, but I think, you remember that time? Okay, so you remember that time when we were in Bali and then we climbed to the top of that volcano and then we were sitting there and then we saw those monkeys, and we were like feeding them and stuff, and there was like this whole colony of monkeys at the top, and obviously like those monkeys are relatively smart animals, and this whole colony has probably prospered because they wait for tourists to climb to the top of that mountain every single morning, and they beg for food or they steal food from us or whatever, and there was like, there's probably at least a couple dozen of them, if not more, that just lived at the top of them. And I remember I was having this thought. I was like, man, these monkeys, like they're such smart like creatures. Um, and the reason I bring that up was because this is the first time I thought of the question that you're asking me now. And at that moment, I realized, man, these guys are so smart. They understand the concept of, or like, they work together as this group, form this like colony at the top of the mountain. They understand that tourists come here every single day. So they're going to come here and beg for food, steal food, whatever they need to do. And they've done it so well to the point where there's like 30 or 40 of them just like running out around here and just kind of like commingling with humans and just like living through that. And there must be some degree of cooperation for them to be able to do that. I think that the degree of even monkeys, which are probably the closest thing to humans, which is probably, you know, one of the smartest like other creatures that exist on this planet. I think that they, to the degree that they're able to cooperate compared to humans, is like not even, like we're not even in the same ballpark. Like even for them, they're like at least a few standard deviations way below humans. You know, they're like 1% of the capacity of what the human can do compared to, like, yes, they can cooperate, but that's like saying like, hey, like the way like a preschooler cooperates versus like, you know, some PhDs. You know what I mean? The amount they know is like very little. Because if you think about it, right, like a human has been able to figure out a way to not just cooperate within like, you know, like let's say a monkey's climbing a tree and sees a tiger and starts screaming and stuff, and all the monkeys know that that pitch of scream means there's a tiger coming, so get the fuck out. You know, I think that's like incredibly like basic. Humans have figured out how to cooperate, not just like within like, hey, I make this noise and that means like, you know, there's, I don't know, maybe like a handful of things that can be happening. Humans have been figured out how to cooperate beyond this lifetime. Like, you know, we can like write and create books and stuff like that. And somebody that lived like 500 years ago can pass me a message that could directly affect like my life. You know, somebody that living 2,000 years ago, obviously the Bible, like has affected all of humanity. It doesn't matter where or who the fuck you are. Like you've been affected by this book that was written 2,000 years ago. So I just think like the degree that humans can do that is, you know, hundreds, 100x plus any other animal, which is why the awakening process for a human is so, I think it's a different ball game that we're talking about. For a monkey to awaken and for a human to awaken, it's like not even, I don't even know if they're sleeping, you know what I mean? Like they're probably just going about their day and they just know how to make these noises. And but yeah, I think we're talking about different degrees here, enough that it changes the definition of awakening, perhaps. I don't know if that answer made any sense at all, but
No, yeah, and it doesn't always have to, right? It's exploratory, and it definitely made me think that it's funny when I asked you that question. I came from the perspective that monkeys can't experience awakening, and as you kept talking, I actually thought that they could actually experience awakening. And this is maybe what dovetails into my definition of awakening, but I think awakening comes, I mean, fundamentally from this idea that free will exists, which, just for everyone on the call, I don't believe in free will, right? When you look at animals, you don't believe that they have free will, right? You see like, oh, my dog eats because he's hungry. Like, you know, that animal did this because it's just an animal, right? It's operating off of instinct. It's actually not choosing anything, right? So there's like a base level of choice and optimization, like decision optimization. But even then is not even quite at the next level. I think the next level, which really unlocks the potential for awakening, is desire, right? Like not on top of like choosing the something that may go against instinct or surface level decisions, like the desire, the craving for the hypothetical next, right? And so a monkey might even actually have that. I imagine that, you know, I want resources, I want more resources, I want access to that berry bush, you know, I want to have sex with like Joe Monkey's wife, like I want to become chieftain. And that I think I think we've all seen monkeys get sad, right? And so it's this like mechanism, this engine that creates emotional content, I think, that is the substrate that makes awakening even possible, right? And so awakening is, I think, a a return back to nature, wherein we get caught up in hyper optimization and we get caught up in hyper craving and desire, and we feel as if we are acting outside of nature. We feel as if we are acting independently, autonomously, and separated. Once you become awakened, you remember, if you will, to use that often, that verb that is used a lot in these circles. You remember that you are not separate, right? You remember that you are actually not really choosing, and that like life doesn't really work that way. It's not a series of calculations. It actually just flows, which allows you, I think, to transcend the suffering that arises out of not getting what you want. And that at the end of the day, we're just animals. So, and interconnected. So that's kind of, I guess, one slice, one grazing, if you will, from your awakening. There's so many different like shots you can take on that concept, but yeah, like we by far can experience the most severe of awakenings just by virtue of the stories, the depth of stories, the texture of the stories that we can conjure up about ourselves and others, which again, once you awaken, you realize that it's not anything you can grab, right? It's just like not anything you can touch, feel, grab, but you can simulate it in a way that feels extremely real. Like I can just think about something and my heart rate rises, and it might as well be that I'm actually going through it. Don't think other animals have that capability, that imagination engine. So
Yeah, I mean, I think you articulated that a lot better than I could have. But I think that answer to the question you asked, if monkeys can awaken, for me, I think you just answered in the last sentence when you said the degree of awakening is the highest for us, based on the complexity of our minds. Obviously, that imagination engine, the fact that we have complex enough minds to allow us to use language, symbols, and things like that to represent complex things, not just like, hey, this noise equals this like rock over here, but this noise equals this person, and this noise describes this person's personality and describes like this person's like, wants, needs, and desires. And like to be able to get to that depth, and not just describing people, but describing like concepts like, science, the idea of physics, that, like, and all these things, like awakening and being able to see all those labels, symbols, and constructions for what they are. Since we're able to, like, we can build, humans for sure can build the most complex of things, and the reason we can build the most complex of things is because our minds can hold very complex ideas and concepts and stuff like that, compared to like most other, or compared to all creatures on Earth. So when we do happen to awaken and we see the mental constructions that we've built, not just as individuals, but the ones that we ascribe to collectively, that degree, I think, is much higher than, like a monkey or even like the smartest of whatever creatures there are out there.
Yeah, almost certainly. And actually, I wanted to steer the conversation or scope it back down and see your thoughts on it. For me, a prerequisite of awakening isn't necessarily just like the acknowledgement of constructs or artifice, right, in society, world, whatever. Like, I think there's a good amount of people who are not quote unquote awakened that understand the idea of mental constructs. But I would propose in this conversation that awakening is actually a deeply personal thing that comes from the question of like, who am I, right? It's almost like, and now we're kind of tiptoeing into this concept of ego and ego death, and that causes a crisis in people, right? Whether it's ego death or inquiry into the self that's obliterated by like a crazy traumatic event, or just time, like, they call it midlife crisis. Somewhere around that time, humans have been long enough, despite doing whatever they do, to be like, who am I? Like, I'm gonna die. Like, who am I? And I feel like it's the dissolution of the self construct, and the grieving and the pain and the process of that really, really starts to touch on awakening, right? And how you navigate and come through that, because sometimes people just hop from like crisis to crisis, honestly, and they fill it with another thing. But when all of the pieces kind of like lay down, like, how do you, whatever I think ultimately arises out of that is the most persistent, resilient, global, that you will carry on until you die, honestly, because I think awakening, once you get there, is not a place you come back from. You know, I think fundamentally, yeah, it goes back to how you see yourself. And then once you start to understand that, you're able to then extrapolate that out to everyone else too. Like, it must be like, if for me, thus for everybody else. So maybe, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on awakening from a more of a personal scope, right? Maybe even drawing some examples from yourself, your experience.
Um, let's see here. You did say a lot there. And I think I was on the same page with you, definitely before this conversation that we had too, because um, when we were doing like our little pre-work for this, for the 5 minutes before we started recording, I did play around with the same idea that, and this is a topic that we've discussed in previous conversations on this podcast. When we start talking about topics like what is ego and stuff like that, I think that's like the first the first step, if you will, to or for many people, that's like the first step to awakening. A lot of this, I guess, like the spiritual books, like Eckhart Tolle's books, The Power of Now. I think even Michael Singer's book, The Untethered Soul, and there's probably countless others. Chapter 1 is always, what is the voice in your head? It's a very common, like, this chapter 1. And the thing is, usually, like, when you're reading that for the first time, it's an interesting read, and it always feels kind of like weird to read about, hey, what is that voice? And you start actually like trying to figure out what that is, because you actually have a voice that you can directly observe if you actually wanted to. And I think most of those books, they encourage you to do that within the first chapter for a reason. Looking back on it now, I can start to understand why, because I think the opposite of awakening is obviously being, or not obvious, but it's being unconscious to that voice in your head, the voice that's like always there, even when you're not paying attention to it. Like, you might be doing like fully, or trying to fully focus on like this one thing, and then this voice in your head's like telling you about this other shit that you don't like need to be thinking about. Like, where did that voice come from? How did it get there? And why is it saying this stuff that it's saying? Like, who put that there? And if we don't pay attention to it, then all of a sudden we're unconscious, because like this narrative is still running, but we don't know what the hell's going on. Like, we're not aware to the narrative. Now, the reason I think the spiritual books put that in chapter 1 is because once you start actually paying attention to the voice and you become a lot more conscious of the voice, the level of unawareness start to go down, the more aware you are of that voice, because that's the thing that makes you, um, I guess, like unconscious. It's your voice being unconscious. That voice is what is a huge part of the the opposite of awakening, which is, I guess, being asleep or whatever. Um, but once you're able, like, I I guess what I'm building up to is once you get really good at observing that voice in your head, in your own head, and fully being there as much as you possibly can, so that you're rarely unconscious, you start to see some of the shit that voice says, within you. You start to see, like, how that voice affects your life experience very directly. You start to see, like, holy crap, like, I didn't even know, like, this voice talks to me like that, or, like, creates this world that I exist in, and it directly affects my experience. And then so you start to understand yourself a lot better. And once you're able to understand yourself a lot better, you're able to have a lot more compassion for yourself. You're able to, kind of start to gain a little bit of awareness about how it all works. And the funny thing is, once you understand that mechanism within yourself, you can see when other people are unconscious within themselves. And because you're able to have self-compassion, when you see someone that's unconscious, rather than, looking at them, making fun of them, or being like, yo, like, the person's like off, you understand why they're off. So then you're able to have compassion for them too. You're able to share the compassion that you have with yourself, because you understand this mechanism that you didn't understand before, with the people around you. That's the end of my thought. I forgot if I answered the question.
That's beautiful, man. No, that's beautiful. It's funny. It's, by the way, 45 minutes on the timer. I just wanted to call that out. And um, so, okay, first of all, it's worth defining this concept, since we're going to use it over and over on this podcast. It's this concept called the Pareto principle, where 80% of whatever output or whatever measure of anything is actually, how do I say this? Unintuitively within the 20% of it, right? So usually we will say that's the 80-20 of something, when we say, like, okay, that seems like a small slice, is only 20% of this perceived whole, but it's actually representing the 80 once you start to kind of unpack it out, right? And so I just want to throw out there that recognizing your inner voice as being something separate from you, all right, is an 80-20 fundamental first out the gate thing for awakening. 100% agree with that. And the second thing I wanted to say was, so just so people who've been following us, we don't have a title for this podcast yet, but as we start to, chop up and ramble on, there's certain things that kind of like they vibrate a little bit more, they resonate, and I think we always like to call it out. And chapter 1 sounds like a pretty nifty title, if I must say. It'd be a pretty cool ass title, chapter 1. But what's interesting to me actually brings up another podcast title that we were thinking of too, is like the so what, but like, so what, right? Like, okay, so I think in various ways you can arrive to the realization that your voices are not in fact you, and they say all sorts of random shit, and it's not always even one voice. Sometimes it's multiple voices, right? It's like I am, and then sometimes it's you are. Who's the you, right? You're stupid, man. Like, I'm stupid, and all that kind of stuff. It begins to be internalized, and it 100% affects your worldview, right? And it may or may not be true. Like, that's the thing, right? It is this, like, questioning that happens naturally, that arguably allowed us to survive. And when it works, but when it goes haywire, it's pretty crazy, right? Like I go back to that phrase that I don't know, what is it? The mind is a good slave, but a terrible master. If I, heck, if I caught up with you and something was a little off and you were a little short with me, like a voice in my head might be like, oh man, like he doesn't like you, or you said something stupid. That could be true. Maybe I did say something stupid. Maybe he doesn't actually like me, or he could just had like no sleep that day and is working on something like or has something personal in his life. That could also be true. How would you ever know about that? But likely, there's like n number of alternative scenarios that we never even entertain, and it compounds, right? Like if I take that path that people don't like me, I'm more likely to take it every time, and then I end up living a very small, in a very like it's a very sad life to do that. So I think that voice is very important. Um, but going back to the so what, right? So you start to see uh, your voice is data. You can trust it or distrust it. Like, what do you do now? Um, and which is where you're kind of back at the start in the sense of your opening statement of these are the things that allow us to kind of operate more fluidly, right? With people, like mm, there is you can't be second guessing everything, right? Like as you go through life. I mean, I work in a corporate setting. In any given day, I'm talking to so many people, like in just sprinting. It's hard to not lean on that voice to make quick decisions and make quick assertions. And maybe the answer is just to rebuild it, rebuild it completely, which is very hard to do, most certainly because there are things in society that they almost seem like it's hard to go through it without getting all the mud on you, um, which is why monastics exist, like monks and stuff, that they have to shave their head because even tending to your hair and will cause like an attachment about having hair or not having how good it looks, right? They don't get in a relationship because that will also cause uh, you know you to trip up more easily. um, so yeah, I think, sorry, veered quite off course there from awakening. And I think in part one thing that I wasn't sure going into this podcast of like how much of it was more of an educational step through awakening. um, but and maybe I'll sum it up with this. Like I think awakening is deeply, deeply personal, uh, a process that never ends. Um, Something that, while you won't lose the fundamentals of it, like you can't ever go back to sleep, I would argue, once you've been awakened. Um, you can certainly forget at times. And I think that's also a part of the awakening. So interesting stuff. Interesting stuff.
I think we got time because we started the Zoom call, and then like remember we had that first like 15-minute chunk where we're just kind of like deciding to get coffee and stuff.
Yeah.
So I think we have I think 40. I think we started around 7:30, so the 45-minute point probably
Got it.
10 or 15. So we're still okay on time if the conversation takes us that far.
Okay, cool.
Um,
Yeah, I saw the timer. I wasn't sure if it was the recording timer or the total meeting duration, but it sounds like it's the latter.
yeah,
So,
so we're pulling up on a little bit more than 30 minutes right now, so I think we should be okay.
yeah.
Um, but it's funny. Before this whole thing started, um, so I never do my hair anymore. But I started. I had an event last night, so I had to do my hair, and then
No wonder.
I never get up at 7 in the morning. Um, so obviously, like I didn't get that much sleep, and I woke up, and obviously I don't have time to shower for this, so came on the came on the came on the Zoom call, came on the podcast, and I was like, man, should I wear a hat? And then you were like, yo, well, I'm wearing a hat for the exact same reason, because obviously when you wake up before showering, your hair is like kind of out of place, and then you're bringing up monastics now, like yeah, they shave their head because that's like a thing. Um, Even having hair is something that you kind of have to manage because you're managing your image, your self-image, your image that you portray out to other people. Um, and then I told you, I was like, well, I guess I'm banking on the fact that no one's ever going to watch this, so no one's ever going to see it. Um, But it's interesting that we circled all the way back around, even something like, like your hair, which I guess some people think a lot about their hair, but I'm not one of those people. But even myself, I'm just like, man, I should probably have taken a shower or put a hat on or something before this, right? Um, so
I
yeah, I guess.
love it. Like, yes, little things you can use to teach about this. Like, and you know what's funny? I cut my hair like 2 days ago with that same mentality, whereas like, I was liking having something in style, and it was really long, but it was really getting in the way because I do a lot of sports and what have you, and also uh, this conversation of awakening actually parallels even like my own personal life, and like I'm kind of re-stepping through those things. And so I was like, you know what? Fuck it, let's shave it all off, right? Let's go back to the buzz. And it was for me actually like I was imagining like going back to kind of like monastic. In doing so, like I wanted to lighten up my life, but going on this podcast again, I haven't had a buzz cut in a really long time, and so I felt strange going on. I felt strange not having something on my head. Like it's funny, just a monkey that needs something on his head, right? So then I put on my hat. And I was like, oh, this gives me a little bit of something. It makes me feel a little bit more, yeah.
It
And
gives
it's
you, gives you some
yeah,
cover.
it is so funny. I'm really like that. The hair thing alone in this conversation is what makes this podcast really special to me. I would say is how again we're just talking, and then you get these little moments, so
It's really hard to answer that so what question though. Like why is it important? I think that's the question. Um, I mean, I think in my last ramble 5 minutes ago, I was saying that because I'm able to within myself see this mechanism that kind of like just talks all day. Um, when I sit down and meditate, sometimes when I see some of the shit that it says, I think the voice in my head is actually a pretty kind one compared to what other people has based on my conversations with my friends and stuff. But at times, like when I'm at my worst, like it could definitely like get to a point where it's just like I guess like a little like cutting. Um, and to be unconscious to this voice that you're taking so seriously that's cutting you, I think that creates a negative life experience um, within yourself. So once you have awareness around that, you can choose which parts of that voice you, I guess, like want to listen to or take seriously, and which parts you don't. Number one. Number two, I think there's probably a way to reprogram that voice, and I think that voice is built based on beliefs that you've um, created throughout your life experience, and perhaps some of those life experiences could have been negative, like traumatic experiences, and then so you develop this belief, and now with this belief, when your mind sees something, that voice is going to be reflective of that belief, whatever that belief is. That's kind of how I think cognitive behavioral therapy works. When you talk to like a therapist and they're trying to figure out what your underlying beliefs are so they can help you like reprogram it. I think the voice is a good indicator of what your beliefs are based on like the shit that it says to you. So number one, I think you can ignore, once you have awareness of that voice, you can ignore the shit that isn't helpful. Number two, you can maybe even start reprogramming some of the stuff, to imagine if you had a more empowering voice. If every time you made a mistake, it was like, yo, like mistakes are here for us to learn, like keep going, like, more effort, like things like that, rather than, yo, you fucked up. You always make mistakes. What the fuck? You know what I mean? Like imagine having like those two different voices and being able to like pick and choose how that voice talks to you. That could give you a completely different life experience, all in itself. And then number three, I think that I touched on this earlier. Once you understand how that mechanism works within yourself, and you wake up from your own unconsciousness, and it's not I guess it could be a binary thing. I don't think I'm awakened yet to the point where I could tell you there's a binary thing. but it does feel gradual. It does feel like, hey, when I read about this concept when I was like 26, uh, like I wasn't even close. And then it does feel throughout the years as I started meditating more, as I, explored my own mind, through psychedelics and through other practices, through reading, and it does feel like I've gradually built more awareness around my voice over the years and being able to affect that more. So I think number three, once you realize that mechanism within yourself and you have more awareness around that within yourself, then you can see the different levels of unconsciousness in other people, and that will help you have more compassion for them. When you see that someone's like highly unconscious, I don't think it's perfect writing to be like, hey, that person is doing something that's completely unconscious, and I can just like excuse it for what it is. But understanding, well, this person probably doesn't know what's going on. Like if you saw like a child acting up, you would have more compassion for that child than if you saw an adult acting up. But what if the adult's mind is even more like fucked up than the child's mind because of the voice in their head? Then shouldn't you have more compassion for that adult? So those are the three things. I don't know if I hit on them enough to. Those are my three so whats for awakening, I guess, or not just awakening, but the first step of awakening, which is the voice in your head, and doing more work that.
Yeah, well said. Well said. I came up with my brain can't help myself. I just always jump from metaphor to metaphor to metaphor. So I got three metaphors that queued up as you're talking. So I think I'm gonna choose something that actually is like so emotional, like has so much emotional content in it. So the idea here that I'm trying to step into is that like there are certain things in our field of awareness that even before we even can think that there's an embedded belief or voice there, like it hits us, right? Like you see something, like you can see like someone beating up another person, right? Immediately, and it's like super one-sided, and you're like, holy shit, that guy's getting fucked up. And you might have a distaste for violence and for the lesser person, you might immediately be hit with something. Turns out like, it was like justified, whatever. But anyway, I'm gonna go with color. Color is gonna be the thing I'm gonna choose here, just because I think that for a lot of people, you can't see color and not immediately get hit by something, right? Whether it came from society, black versus white, a lot of societies have that. Red, blue, the entire engine of capitalist marketing is around colors. And it's funny because even as I grew up through life, like my preference for colors changed too. Like I started off liking blue a lot, and I like red. So I look at red things more. I don't know. I fix my life, adorn my life more with red things. And it's not to say that I'll ever probably get away from having color preferences, but I think that a big part of awakening and starting to realize that like even the fact that like colors are, what the heck does color has no moral value. It's just like wavelength, like light waves, that you get to appreciate the rainbow, right? Or you get to appreciate that like that person likes to wear like khaki and olive only, or that person only wears black, they're a goth, right? And it's like you get to see the full gradient of all, and kind of just be like, yeah, that's really awesome, and what have you. It's fun to kind of visit that part of the color spectrum or that color spectrum. So, and I think awakening helps unlock like thinking in that way about lots of things that you might not imagine that there's a rainbow of, right, for it. The other bit of awakening I think about in terms of so what and practical application is I always for life go back to this concept of like surfing as being a very like foundational metaphor. Lots of spiritual people like to talk about ocean and waves and use that as a concept. But I think where I want to take a step further and apply the human element to it. Yes, we are a wave connected to an ocean and whatever, but like the human surfing the wave is something I think has a lot to it as well, because you don't ever get to choose your wave. and you can try to find yourself put yourself in a position to catch the right wave. Um, but like whatever is given to you is given to you, right? And you gotta do something. You gotta write it. You gotta write it out. And I think that the difference between people who are awakened are the people who do their best to position themselves to catch the wave. They get on the wave and they just ride it, whether it's a good wave, a bad wave, whether they fall, whether they have to go do it again, versus people who spend time wishing that the waves were different. I want the wave to come to me. I don't want to have to swim to the wave. Like that wave's not high enough. That wave's not low enough. So I think surfing is another big part of it. Because life is really, I think, just a series of waves that come to us in our waking moments. And then the last metaphor I also like to go back to a lot in life is this concept of hiking, right? And I think that we are born into a world in which many, many millions of before of us, our ancestors, have walked a path, right? And this was the path from life to death. And then that path gets grooved just by virtue of people stepping on it, walking through it, carving it out. And eventually those paths starts to branch through the changing times, right? And there might be another veering path. And for a long time, you find yourself on that path, on any one of those paths that have been already like mapped out, and you may learn a lot about yourself as you go, may or may not, depending how, deliberate you are. But almost, I think that in more ancient traditional societies and arguably more collectivist societies, it's easier to kind of stay on a path with other people. Like, hey, let's travel as a group, right? Let's stay on this path. It's nice, comfortable, it's secure. Nothing wrong with being in a group, and nothing wrong with being on a path that someone already did for you, right? But especially, this is a symptom of the society that we are in Western context, that it is hyper individualized. It is like, what is your resume? What is your sense of style? Like, it's you. Like, what's your social media? Like, aren't you hustling enough, right? That you're asking everybody to make their own path. And that is almost kind of what we talked about in the beginning, which is that like maybe that like introspection is what kind of starts awakening. It makes it really hard. And as you forge into your own path, like you said, you're gonna have to, it's gonna challenge you in a way that it's gonna maximally challenge you as a human, right? You're gonna look at other people's paths, you're gonna figure out your path, and you're gonna have to like figure it out. Like jungles, I don't know if you try to walk through a jungle, it's freaking hard. You got a machete and everything, and I'll end it on a actually optimistic note I haven't thought of before. This is my first time thinking of it, that maybe the pain that we are going through as a society, by forcing each person to kind of do that, will somehow result in a mass awakening of sorts, where when we come back together, right? Everything oscillates, right? Maybe things oscillate from fragmentation and disintegration back to integration, and maybe there's like that's the good note at the end of this. So sorry, so I'll close with one more thing. I also think that one other fundamental part of awakening is suffering. Like, you have to, unless you are like the Dalai Lama reincarnated, which actually I think one of the measures of the Dalai Lama reincarnated, a reincarnated like Buddha or whatever type, Bodhisattva type, is that they just ease into that path so well, right? They didn't have to like suffer massively in order to awaken. Like, it was available, and they're able to like know that and be able to share that But for I think for 99.9% of us, and you know what, actually, Hag, we talked about suffering, personal to you too, but maybe 99.8% of us have to kind of go through that kind of like major suffering, in order to really shock you out of it, shock you out of your dream. So
I like those metaphors, the three metaphors put out there. Um, I feel like that was probably a good note to end on. I don't have anything. I can make up something, but I don't have anything top of mind to put out there. But I feel like there were a couple of jumping off points. I don't know if maybe we should try to pick one and have that be the question we marinate on to the next week. Um, you did bring up collective awakening versus individual awakening, or I mean, you didn't say versus, but I think you said something like, um, you said maybe the pain we go through as a society, like finding our own individual like selves or awakening or whatever, will help us towards like a mass awakening, inflection point at some point. I wonder if we want to talk about. Okay, I have more questions than answers in this realm, so I don't even know if we should go to this topic. But what would like a mass or a collective awakening even look like? What the hell is that? Like, I know Eckhart Tolle talks about it. He seems to think that there's going to be another level of consciousness of awakening, if you will. That's inevitable. Otherwise, we won't make it as a species. So I don't know. That could be an interesting topic, but I'm definitely not. Um, I'm not well versed to talk about any of these topics, but I'm actually like I would have to do some research to even be able to touch on that one. But that might be a cool topic. I don't know. You said a lot. You talked about a fundamental part of awakening being suffering. Um, I actually don't know a lot about that. I've read about, and I have other friends that would ascribe to that belief too, but I don't have as much direct experience with that as others have. So that would be interesting to me as well. I don't know. Do you have anything you want to talk about on the next pod? Maybe it's a good time to save some of these jumping off points and consider them during the week.
yeah, I think so. I think this is a good natural stopping point for us. Lots of good stuff, and I think there's a lot of threads we can start to pull from here and have fun with. Ultimately, I want, the vision for this is for it to be really fun for the both of us. So I think let's go ahead and call it here. And I actually think we stepped into something much bigger, and we're also hitting a little bit of a stride here that I don't think that we will ever in this podcast not be talking about awakening. There's so many things we can talk about that are just proxies for awakening. We can have a topic that talks about this one topic, this pod that talks this one topic, and I think even at the surface level, even if it doesn't seem like it, there will be this undercurrent of kind of peering beneath a little bit more, which I think will be, really fun to kind of skillfully balance, while staying on topic. I'm not saying that every conversation is going to jump into the metaphysical, spiritual, but I think that might be the thing that makes this interesting for us to keep going down. So, yeah.
Yeah, I can already think of a lot of topics that spring just from this conversation. I mean, a lot of the spirituality stuff that I ascribe to, it kind of points to, like, it talks around awakening, because you can't just use this word awakening and people know what it means. You have to, there's a lot of context there basically. So
Yeah.
So everything we talk about will be around that.
Yeah.
All right, let's end it there. I'm gonna stop the recording.
Sounds good. Over and out.